Nehemiah was 52 days from finishing the wall when the mockery started. Not before he began after. Right when the stones were already stacked higher than anyone expected, someone laughed and called it a fox's project, something that would collapse if a fox so much as walked across it. Then the mockery turned into a conspiracy men from 5 directions actually planning an attack. Then his own crew, the very people building beside him, got tired enough to say the strength of the laborers is failing, and there's too much rubble to ever finish. Then came the invitations. Friendly ones. Come. Let's meet and talk this through. Then came advice wrapped in spiritual language, sounding careful, sounding wise, telling him to hide, to stop, to protect himself. Every single attack landed in the final stretch. Not the first week, the last one. And if the hardest resistance of your life has shown up recently, I want you to ask a harder question than why is this happening? Ask which stretch you're actually in. You've probably heard the claim that some huge percentage of people quit right before they succeed. It gets repeated in every motivational video, every caption, every course, usually with a number attached that sounds too precise to be made up. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody can actually point to where that number comes from. It isn't a study. It's a legend that grew on top of a real idea, repeated so many times it started sounding like data. And that matters, because if we're going to talk about the enemy trying to make you quit right before your breakthrough, we shouldn't need a fake statistic to make the point land. The real evidence is better than the myth, it's just quieter, scattered across pulpits, gyms, research labs, and scripture, all pointing at the same pattern from completely different directions. Because here's what actually needs to be said before we go any further. Not every hard season is spiritual resistance. Some doors close because they were always supposed to close. Some paths need to end, and staying on them out of stubbornness isn't faith. It's pride wearing faith's clothes. So, the question underneath everything in this video isn't just how do I push through, it's how do I tell the difference? Resistance worth pushing through, and a door God is actually closing can feel almost identical from the inside. But they are not the same thing, and Scripture gives us a way to tell them apart. So here are 7 signs the enemy wants you to quit, right? Before your breakthrough, and at the end, the one test that separates real resistance from a road you were never meant to finish. The first sign is the one Nehemiah felt, before anyone else noticed it. The resistance doesn't fade as you get closer. It gets louder. Sanballat's mockery in Nehemiah 4-3 wasn't fired at the beginning of the project. It landed once the wall had already reached half its height in verse 6, right when the momentum was undeniable. When mockery didn't stop him, the opposition escalated into an actual conspiracy in Nehemiah 4-8, Ashdod, Ammon, and Arabia plotting together to attack Jerusalem by force. David lived a version of this too. He wasn't hunted hardest by Saul the day he was anointed. He was hunted hardest years later, after he'd already proven himself in battle, after the people were already singing his name louder than the king's. The threat escalated in proportion to how real the promise had become. That's the pattern worth noticing. The enemy doesn't spend his best resources on people who are already stuck. He spends them on people who are about to finish. Now, we have to be careful here, because escalating opposition on its own doesn't automatically mean you're on the right path. Some people mistake stubbornness for faith and keep pushing into something that was never God's plan to begin with. But there's a difference in the texture of the resistance. A wrong path tends to produce a quiet, sinking dread, the sense that something inside you already knows to stop. Near breakthrough resistance produces noise, chaos, urgency. It wants your attention pulled toward the attack instead of the work. If what you're facing feels less like conviction and more like a coordinated distraction, that's not the sign to abandon what you're building. That's a sign of how close you actually are. The second sign shows up not in your enemies, but in your own camp. In Nehemiah 4:10, it isn't an outsider who says the project is failing, it's Judah, Nehemiah's own people, saying the strength of those who carry the load is giving out, and there's too much rubble left to rebuild. That's not sabotage. That's exhaustion, speaking through people who are actually on your side. Job experienced something that cut even deeper. His friends didn't leave. They stayed, and used the staying to build a case against him, insisting his suffering had to be evidence of some hidden sin. And in Job 19:13, 1-4, Job himself names it plainly. His brothers are estranged, his close friends have forgotten him, his relatives have failed him. Sometimes the enemy doesn't need new opposition. He just needs to turn the discouragement of people near you into something that sounds like discernment. The test here isn't whether someone raises a concern. Real friends do that. And ignoring wise correction isn't faith, it's pride. The test is what the words leave behind. Discouragement dressed as concern makes you smaller. It makes you doubt not just the plan, but yourself. Real correction, even when it's hard to hear, leaves you clearer, not smaller. If the people around you are handing you fatigue disguised as wisdom, that fatigue is not proof you should stop. It may be proof the finish line moved close enough to threaten someone else's comfort with your progress. The third sign convinces the most people because it doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like the truth. It's exhaustion, the kind that doesn't just tire your body, it starts rewriting your convictions. Paul addresses this directly in Galatians 6:9. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say you won't get tired. He assumes you will. He says don't let the tiredness make the decision for you, because that's exactly how it usually happens. Not one dramatic collapse of faith, but a slow leak. People who study why others eventually walk away from something they once believed keep landing on the same finding. It rarely happens in one crisis moment. It happens gradually, in the seasons where the weariness never gets confronted, until one day a person realizes they simply stopped believing what they used to carry so certainly. And it isn't only happening in pews. Ask people who've spent their lives building something they were genuinely called to pastors, specifically, and a striking number will admit that somewhere in the middle of the work they seriously considered walking away. Not because the calling stopped being real, because the exhaustion started feeling more real than the calling. That's the danger of this sign. It doesn't announce itself as doubt. It shows up disguised as being reasonable, tired, and done. But in due season is not a vague promise. It's a timeline you're already standing inside of, even on the days you can't feel it moving. The fourth sign looks the least like an attack, because it arrives sounding like peace. In Nehemiah 6:2, Sanballat and Geshem send a message. Come, let us meet together. Nehemiah's answer is one of the sharpest lines in the whole book. I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down? To you? They tried 4 times. Same invitation, same tone of reasonableness, 4 separate times. When that didn't work, the tactic changed shape entirely. In Nehemiah 6:10, a man named Shemaiah, someone who sounded like an ally, who used the language of prophecy and self-preservation, advised Nehemiah to hide in the temple because his life was in danger. It sounded like wisdom. It even sounded like faith. But Nehemiah discerned it correctly in verse 13. The counsel was designed to make him sin, so his enemies would have a story to discredit him with afterward. Here's what makes this sign so dangerous. It never announces itself as opposition. It shows up as a reasonable meeting, a cautious voice, a spiritual-sounding reason to step back. To be fair, not every invitation to rest is a trap. Real Sabbath is commanded, not optional. And burnout is something Scripture takes seriously, not something it shames. But there's a difference between rest that returns you to the work restored and a reasonable pause engineered to make sure you never come back to it at all. The fifth sign is silence, the specific kind that makes you start interpreting God's character instead of just waiting on His timing. Daniel fasted and prayed for 3 weeks with nothing happening. No answer, no movement, nothing visible for 21 straight days. Then an angel finally appears and says something that should stop you. Cold. From the first day, your words were heard. Not the 21st day, the first. But then he adds the strange part, a spiritual prince resisted him for 21 days until reinforcement arrived. That means Daniel's answer wasn't late. It was resisted. Job experienced a version of this from the opposite angle. He begged for an audience with God, and for chapter after chapter, heaven stayed silent while his friends kept talking instead. Most of us, sitting in a silence that's lasted weeks or months, assume the silence means nothing is happening, when Scripture keeps insisting the opposite is at least possible. This is not a formula. Not every unanswered prayer is angelic warfare, and turning every delay into a cosmic battle can become its own kind of manipulation. Sometimes God simply says wait or no, because the timing or the request itself needs to change. But Daniel 10 proves this much for certain. You cannot measure what heaven has done only by what earth has shown you yet. If the silence has started to feel like evidence against you, that interpretation is doing more damage than the silence itself. The sixth sign shows up when you start watching someone else's timeline, instead of walking your own. It's the moment their door opens while yours stays shut, and a quiet thought creeps in that maybe you're doing something wrong, or maybe they're simply favored in a way you're not. Joseph lived years of this in reverse, dreaming of a future that seemed to move further away with every chapter, sold into slavery while his brothers' lives moved on without consequence, forgotten in a prison cell by the very man he'd helped remember his own dream. This is where the enemy's oldest tactic resurfaces, not attacking what happened to you, but attacking how you interpret it, standing next to someone else's story. Even researchers who spend their careers studying persistence run into this exact fork. One of the leading voices on Grit has said plainly that there's such a thing as quitting at exactly the right time, and there's also such a thing as quitting on a bad, discouraged day, making a permanent decision off a temporary feeling. The hard part is that both moments can look identical from the inside. Comparison makes it worse because it turns your own pace into a referendum on your worth, instead of just information about your specific path. Job never got an explanation for why his suffering outpaced everyone around him. He got God restoring him not because the comparison finally made sense, but because it was never the right question to begin with. If someone else's breakthrough is currently making yours feel like failure, that feeling is not data. It's the accusation working exactly the way it's designed to. The seventh sign feels the most like relief, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. It's the moment quitting stops feeling like defeat and starts feeling like peace, like finally putting something down instead of giving up on it. This moment has a predictable location. It rarely happens at the very start, when everything is new and the cost hasn't registered yet. It shows up in the middle, the exact stretch where the effort has piled up but the result still hasn't surfaced. Watch what happens every January in gyms across the country. The walkouts don't spike in week 1. They spike months in, right around the point where the body would have actually started changing. If anyone had stayed a little longer, that's not a coincidence limited to fitness. It's the shape of almost every real breakthrough. The effort and the evidence rarely arrive on the same day. So here is the test. The one thing that actually separates resistance worth pushing through from a door God is genuinely closing. Ask what's happening underneath the tiredness. If the conviction is still there, if the calling, the assignment, the "this still matters" is still intact, and only your energy is gone, that's exhaustion, talking, not truth. But if the conviction itself is gone, if you no longer believe this was ever the right thing, that's not weariness. That's a different conversation entirely, and it deserves honesty, not more effort. Most of the 7 signs in this video describe the first kind, and Paul wrote directly to people standing exactly where you're standing. Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Not if you feel strong, not if the timing makes sense to you, only if you do not give up. Nehemiah finished that wall in 52 days. 52 days of mockery, conspiracy, exhausted laborers, false meetings, and spiritually worded advice telling him to stop. When it was finished, even his enemies noticed something they couldn't explain away. In Nehemiah 6:16, the surrounding nations perceived that the work had been accomplished with the help of God because it was too fast, too complete to be explained any other way. That's usually how it works. The resistance that feels unbearable in the final stretch is rarely the part of the story anyone remembers afterward. What people remember is that the wall got built. So if the last few weeks or months have felt like everything turned up the volume right when you expected it to get quiet, the mockery, the tired people around you, the reasonable sounding invitations to stop, the silence, the comparison, the pull toward relief, take that seriously, but not as a verdict. Take it as a location marker. You are not falling apart. You may simply be 52 days from finished. Let us not grow weary. In due season, we will reap.